I want to welcome you to this webinar with Andy Crouch. Andy, welcome. We're so glad to have you joining us online for this conversation. Many of us have read the article that you and two colleagues published back in March entitled Leading Beyond the Blizzard: Why Every Organization is Now a Startup. Just to give a little background for those who are watching, Andy is a partner for theology and culture at Praxis, which is an organization that works as a creative engine for redemptive entrepreneurship. He's written a book entitled Culture Making: Recovering Our Creative Calling. And frankly, a lot of us just thought that this article he and his colleagues published was incredibly helpful and insightful. So Andy, welcome to this webinar for the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. I think our format, friends, is that Andy is going to make a presentation that will go on for a little while, and then he will open it up to questions. If you have a question you want Andy to respond to, please email it to smartin@txcumc.org. That's the address for Shannon Martin, our communications director. She will then forward it to me, and I will ask your question to Andy. Andy, we hear you gladly. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Bishop Jones. Thank you to Morris Mathis, who made the initial invitation, and to Shannon, who's helping us. And again, Shannon, along with the bishop, will be kind of fielding your questions for the majority of this time, for as much of a conversation as we can effectively do on Zoom. So please do send your questions by email, primarily to her, smartin@txcumc.org. I think the chat function is up and running as well, but let's rely on the email for the main content of the questions, we'll say. And it's really a pleasure to be with you. The United Methodist Church was my own formative Christian environment, although I've been sojourning with Episcopalians for a number of years now after I married one. But my theological education was at Boston University School of Theology, United Methodist Seminary, and I am very much still a Wesleyan. I'm thrilled to be have the bishop, a Wesley scholar and student, helping to facilitate this conversation. Because actually, as I'll say towards the end of my little opening presentation, I actually think that not just the theological, but the pastoral, and we might even say sociological resources that are available to you all in the Wesleyan tradition actually could not be better designed for a moment like the one we're in. And so I have great hope that what I'm going to present to you, though I think some of it might be unsettling and maybe even alarming, I have great hope that the creative response that's available to us right now is of great significance for the advancement of God's mission in the world. So it's a real privilege to get to spend this hour with you. I have spent the first years of my life after seminary in lay campus ministry, then moved to journalism. And in journalism, the way I think of the job that we have as journalists is making complicated things clear quickly for people who could be doing something else. And that's my little capsule definition of what we do. It distinguishes us from some other fields. For example, scholars sometimes seem like they make clear things complicated instead of the other way around. Probably not entirely fair. My wife is a scholar. She has a PhD. She's the Dr. Crouch in our house. So scholars do important work, but there's this also work of coming after the complexity has been kind of unveiled and making it clear. Then there's the challenge of doing it quickly for people who could be doing something else. And in this way, we journalists have a lot in common with preachers, because that's the job of the preacher as well, to take all of the accumulation of scholarship and learning and yet turn it into something that is quickly delivered, relatively speaking, for people who could or could not be with you. So whenever anything big is happening in my world, I do start to revert to my journalistic instincts, and I ask, how can we summarize what's happening in a compelling way that will be helpful to people who may be very busy and distracted with many things, as we all are, and how can I put it into the crispest, clearest context? And so, as with many of us, I really think in the month of February, primarily, having heard vaguely about the quarantines in the city of Wuhan and China and so forth, I began to really study what might be coming at that time, initially to Europe and then eventually to the United States in the form of the novel coronavirus. And I ended up as journalists do, digging as deeply as I could without, of course, being a specialist in any of these fields. It's kind of the work of the journalist to go to places where the specialists do their work, listen to the specialists, and then try to interpret it. And so by March, I realized we really needed some resources to think about this as clearly as we could. And the context in which I was doing this was working with entrepreneurs who come to their ventures, both for-profit and nonprofit, with a faith perspective. And so at Praxis, we're always trying to help people integrate their faith with the businesses they're building and the nonprofits that they're starting. And we realized that this was going to pose some, frankly, massive threats, as well as significant opportunities for the community of entrepreneurs we serve. We work with about 160 portfolio businesses of many sizes, up to about 5,000 employees, many with only 5. They're at all stages, but mostly early stages. They're all incredibly vulnerable to the winds of culture and economics. And out of that came this article called Leading Beyond the Blizzard. So I'm going to just encapsulate a few of the key ideas from that article for you, and then talk about my hunch of some of what this might mean for you as leaders in church and congregational contexts. I'm aware of so much that I don't know about the specifics of your own congregations, the specifics of your location in Texas. The one thing I'm pretty sure of is that blizzard is not the best metaphor for your day-to-day lives or even year-to-year lives. We don't have that many blizzards in Philadelphia either, where I live, but this metaphor actually comes from an infectious disease specialist named Michael Osterholm, and he lives and teaches in Minnesota, where they do get a lot of blizzards. And we picked up on this metaphor, and I want to unplay it for you just for a few moments. Michael Osterholm has said, and has been saying since late January, that we need to think about the coronavirus pandemic not just as a blizzard, but as winter. And by that he means that it's not just a quickly moving event that comes through and is very dramatic, but also quite brief, the way that a blizzard can be. It's a storm of maybe a few days duration that, you know, quickly passes, the snow stops falling, and the plows do their work, and people go back to their normal lives. But in fact, that any pandemic of this kind is going to be of a much longer duration. So if you think about the qualities of these two phenomena, blizzard and winter, blizzard is really about shelter. It's about finding a safe place, waiting it out, not doing very much, just kind of holding on, hopefully with enough supplies to tide you over. And then you look outside and relatively quickly the snow stops falling and you start thinking, well, I can go outside again. When we wrote the piece, Leading Beyond the Blizzard, we published it on March 20th. And at that moment, it really felt like the snow was closing in, you might say. Lockdown orders had been issued in many states. I'm not sure that they had been yet in Texas in the way that they have been for the past few weeks, but the storm was kind of upon us. And indeed, about 4 weeks later, I think we all feel like the blizzard is lifting again. One of the incredibly hopeful things that's happened is that we have largely flattened the curve, as the epidemiologists say. And most hospital systems have not been overwhelmed. New York came very close, but managed to make it without catastrophic disruption of healthcare. In many parts of the country, case loads have remained relatively low. Deaths have remained relatively low, though there are many places that are seeing a very significant spike in deaths. So this is a very real phenomenon. But it is true that the initial phase is starting to pass. And of course, Governor Abbott has already sort of laid out a plan very soon for reopening at least some parts of daily life in the state of Texas. So the blizzard feels like, it's almost over. I think we made it. Unfortunately, that's not really the nature of pandemics. This is going to be more like winter. And if you think about the difference between a blizzard and winter, winter is longer and in many ways harder. And maybe many of you relocated at some point to a part of the world where you never have to think about this, but living in a part of the world where we still have it, during winter, you can go outside, unlike in a blizzard where you're just locked inside, but you can't go out for long. You wear protective clothing when you do go out, and we'll be doing that probably for a long time all across the United States and really all over the world. A lot of things that were normal and possible during other seasons of the year just don't happen during winter. Things that grow at other times don't grow during winter. And maybe most significantly, there's always the chance of another storm. There's always the possibility that there will be another blizzard. Oh, I was going to fly to Chicago, but they're having a winter storm warning. I can't go. And you're always looking at the weather forecast. You're always planning for that contingency of everything being shut down again. That is what it's going to feel like for quite a while. And if you want to ask more questions about the background of this, of course, this is not my area of specialty, but it is an area I've spent a lot of time reading about. I'm happy to fill that out. But I think it's hard to overstate for, especially for people who have sort of thought, oh, this lockdown is terrible, but surely we'll open up back again soon. It's hard to overstate how long it's going to be before life feels like it did just in February in most of the US. It's going to be many, many months, and probably actually not months. As we reflected on this, my colleagues and I started talking about the year 1816, which was remembered by two monikers. One was the year without a summer, and the other more colorful name for 1816 at the time was 1800 and froze to death. It was a year without a summer in the Northern Hemisphere because of a volcanic eruption in Indonesia, what is now Indonesia. Mount Tambora, a volcano, erupted with a massive eruption, one of the largest in modern history. And it led to a climate shift, as volcanic eruptions can do. And there was no growing season. In fact, there were frosts recorded in every month of the year in North America and Europe. It came at the end of something called the Little Ice Age in Europe, which was a multiple 100-year phenomenon that just happened to be one of these cycles of planet cooling that affected European society, to a lesser extent North American society, dramatically changed agriculture, dramatically changed people's way of life. Now, there is no reason at all to think this will be a centuries-long event. We have access to all kinds of scientific resources that are likely to make this a shorter event. But it is very likely to think about this as a 3 to 10 year dramatic change in our lives. And the reasons are partly epidemiological, but they are more importantly economic. Just as the year without a summer started with a volcano, but ended with agricultural and economic disruption. So this event is going to start with a pandemic, but even once we have solved the immediate challenges of the pandemic, and that'll be through some combination of vaccine, more effective treatment, perhaps approaching a level of immunity in the population. Even after we've solved the pandemic, the economic effects are going to be massive. Of course, living where you are, you're keenly aware of what's happening to the global supply chain of petroleum products and oil, and that's going to be replicated across many, many sectors. I had a very sobering conversation with someone in the agriculture business just earlier this morning about the coming disruptions to our supply chain for meat. And those of us who are meat lovers, I would just say, enjoy your bacon now. Enjoy your bacon. Thank God you're a Gentile and that you get to eat bacon. You may be vegan pretty soon. We don't know how all this is going to play out. There are different scenarios and there's a whole range of possibilities. But it is very wide to plan for a significant economic disruption that will be global because we're globally linked now. The Spanish flu lasted for 3 years with multiple waves of very serious infections and deaths. That's a reasonable pandemic projection. But the Spanish flu happened in a global economy that at that time was not very linked. We didn't have these long, thin supply chains around the world, and we have them now. So I think we have to think, unfortunately, about an ice age scenario as well. What does this mean? Well, if the blizzard is about shelter, just finding shelter, winter is about survival. And that will be literal for many people for quite a while. Those who are older, certainly than 70. I'm 52, and to be honest, I look at the risk-adjusted mortality rates for this illness, and I'm going to be adjusting my behavior. Anyone who has what are called comorbidities, that is underlying conditions, the most common of which in the American population are diabetes, heart disease, as well as overweight or obesity. All these things really dramatically increase the disease risk. And then there are people who, for any number of reasons, have compromised immune systems. All of these folks are going to be making life and death decisions in a new way for a number of years. So there's going to be literal survival questions that are going to feel very present and existential. And because almost everyone has an older relative or has a relative with some of these conditions, they're going to touch all of us in the way that we live and decide about what we're going to do, what we're not going to do. But I would call attention to the economic survival challenges, especially for smaller ventures, which includes almost all churches. Scott Gottlieb is the former commissioner of the FDA. He's been a very keen observer of this. He and colleagues in a very bipartisan way are producing really good literature on public policy responses to the pandemic. His best guess, and I think it's a very well-informed guess, is that for a number of years we see what he calls an 80% economy. So that's an economy that has contracted because of all the things that really can't continue in the same way. At the extremes, we think about, I was thinking about the one thing that will be good news to you as Wesleyans and Methodists is bars are not going to be able to open. Now, so that of course does not affect any of us in any way, perhaps, but really a bar where people gather around a bar, consume a lot of alcohol, or in close proximity to each other, really, these are not going to reopen probably for a year or more in almost all localities. But there's this cascade outward, right? Restaurants are going to be different. Entertainment is going to be different. Travel and hospitality are going to be different. All the industries that then are dependent on that, the whole food service side of agriculture, the oil and gas that are inputs to transport and to agriculture. There's this cascade outward that his best guess leads to an 80% economy. If you just naively extrapolate from that, that's a 20% reduction in GDP. In the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, which almost all of us obviously lived through and remember well, there was about a 4.3 percentage contraction from top to bottom in the Great Recession in GDP. So 20% is really much more like the Great Depression in recent US history. And it's not going to be spread evenly among all sectors. Government spending will probably stay the same. That means consumer spending and business spending have to go down. And one of our mentors at Praxis, actually based in Texas, though not in your part of Texas, he's the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, very optimistic, very thoughtful, very good leader, works with a lot of nonprofits, extremely generous Christian donor to those nonprofits. And he is advising his nonprofits to plan a scenario in which they see a 60% reduction in giving over the next couple of years. That isn't certain to happen, but it does seem that 20% is the least that most ministries and organizations that depend on discretionary giving should plan on. Can you accomplish your mission if your revenue is cut by even just 20%? What about 40% or 60%? I've been on the phone over the last couple of weeks with leader after leader in churches and nonprofits who are doing 3 budgets, an 80, 60, 40% budget. And one of them asked me just yesterday, how do I do a 40% budget? Do I put all the lines into Excel and just multiply by 0.4? Like, that can't possibly be right. These are massive survival questions. And I really would not want to pass by them too quickly. We know in our research with nonprofits in particular, but also with small businesses, that most of them carry about 2 months of cash. It really could be that many, many small businesses and nonprofits will just have to close up because they won't even be able to survive the winter, let alone the ice age. And churches, generally speaking, follow that same distribution. Churches are further exposed, I'm afraid, for a couple of reasons. One is that our donors tend to be older than the average population, and so they're more exposed to COVID-19. The other is when you look at the profile of givers to many churches, this will vary, of course, by location and even denomination to a small extent. Small business owners are kind of the key donors to most local congregations, and they're the ones at most risk right now. Many of them have no income right now, and that's going to have to affect their generosity in the medium to the long term. We're going to see, and I think we are seeing, what I would call a generosity surge for a little bit, but then there's going to be a scarcity reset. And we need to not take momentary generosity, which may well be happening. I talked to one pastor of a church who said, we're actually up 15% right now in our giving. And that's wonderful. And I think it reflects the generosity of Christian people in times of need. But I think we need to plan for the real scarcity that's going to be ahead. So it would be tempting, I think, to just be kind of overwhelmed by the survival challenges. I want to really urge you to look beyond those, not to neglect those, but to look beyond them to the Ice Age challenge, which is actually not survival. Human beings survive ice ages. We've survived a number of them in the history of the species, including the Little Ice Age in Europe. And the way we do it is by redesigning really at the level of culture, how we live together, how we gather, the kinds of buildings we build, the ways we do things. And this is the great opportunity of this moment. It's actually to take the incredible pressure we're all under, not just to shelter and hunker down and wait, nor just to kind of contract and survive, but to actually use this moment to think about redesigning what we do in ways that will help us survive now, but also actually make our work stronger in the future and make it more resilient, even if a relative worst case scenario, an Ice Age-like scenario, comes to pass. One of the beautiful things about this work is that if the worst case does not come to pass, it actually is not wasted work. Because if you redesign along the right lines, if you redesign under the pressures we're under right now and let it help you become a more healthy organization, congregation, ministry, you actually learn from that and you build creative capacity in your kind of core team of fellow designers that is available to you long after the crisis is over. Let me just mention a couple resources that you have right now that are available through the whole thing. The most important resource that we have, even if all the money is cut off, even if we can't gather, as we cannot in most places right now in person at all, we still have trust. We still have relationship with one another. The Wesleyan word for this is connection. We have connections with other people. And it's the reason that we're all gathered here. It's not because most of you have never met me or heard of me, but you do have relationships with one another. You have relationships with your bishop, with Morris and others who serve you as clergy and as leaders. And because of these connections, you actually have a resource that no blizzard, winter, or ice age can take away. Now is the time to build on those relationships of trust. It's very difficult to establish new relationships of trust in this environment. But now is the time to gather the people who trust you and whom you trust and ask, what could we prototype, pilot, and launch together? So let me talk about those words very briefly. I've learned a lot working with entrepreneurs from what's called design thinking, and it's kind of a revolution in how businesses are created. And the basic idea is that you don't start big, you start small. When entrepreneurs build businesses these days, they less and less start with one big idea and come up with a master plan and a grand strategy. Instead, they just start trying very small things. They call it the MVP, the minimum viable product. And sometimes you'll hear entrepreneurs talk about building a skateboard, not an automobile. So both an automobile and a skateboard can get you from one place to another. But an automobile requires a massive capital investment, probably a multi-billion-dollar investment in a manufacturing plant to make. Whereas a skateboard can be built with just a few parts, just a little bit of tools and know-how, and it can still get people from one place to another. And the idea is that it's much better when you're designing something new to start with the skateboard rather than start with the car. When we work in big institutions and denominations like the United Methodist Church are large established institutions, we often think that real change happens at the level of big, but real change actually happens at the level of small, and that's including the level of small designs. And so I'd really encourage you to do what you've already been doing, but do it maybe more mindfully, which is to start prototyping. And by prototyping, what we mean in the design world is a bunch of small, low-cost experiments that are open-ended and from which we expect mostly to learn. We don't necessarily expect them to succeed, certainly not to wildly succeed. We aren't at all sure they're the finished product or the final thing, but we do it quickly and iteratively, trying over and over how to get something out into the world that will actually make a difference for the people we're trying to serve. You've almost certainly been doing this with your Sunday services. You've been prototyping, like, how do we do this Sunday worship and preaching and teaching in the midst of this crisis? We need to start prototyping in every aspect of the work we've been doing and quickly iterating and learning. And then you get to the point where you can actually pilot. And a pilot is a more comprehensive test. You you invest more resources into it, and you do it with a single question in mind. Pilots always have a question behind them. What are we trying to learn here? What do we think may happen? And then you test, you validate your hypothesis. And then eventually you can launch. You can launch perhaps just a skateboard, but a really good skateboard. You've tried maybe 100 different skateboard designs, and then you launch the best one you've come up with after a few pilots. This is going to be the process we're all going to have to be in. That's why we said every organization is now a startup, because we've never done this before. None of us have ever done it. And in a way, that's a great gift. There's nobody who has expertise, and we all get to learn from each other. And some of the best ideas will come from some of the most unexpected places. Let me just mention two more things. I'll take like 2 more minutes and then be done. I realize I've been talking quite a while here. I would just urge you to plan for very small groups, under 100. Many of your churches, if you pastor the kind of median church in America, it is already under 100 congregates, and that's actually a great advantage right now. Some of you, of course, have congregations that are larger. You're going to need to think in units of 100 and 50 and 10, because those are going to be the public health units that we will all be working with for quite a while. And the great news is that almost everything that matters happens in groups that size anyway. The truth is that large groups and large gatherings are not actually that formational or transformational. When we look at what changes people's lives and when we look at what shapes culture, the one key sort of insight from sociology is that small is where change begins. Absolutely small and relatively small. And this is actually visible in the ministry and work of Jesus. So Jesus builds his ministry in circles that I would call 3, 12, and 120. He has only 3 who are present with him at some of the most important moments of his ministry: the healing of Jairus' daughter, transfiguration, a few other moments. They're part of a somewhat larger circle of 12. And then on Pentecost, which we'll celebrate in a few weeks, there's only 120 people in the room. The incredible power of this is that to start a world-changing movement, all you need is 120 people. We have empirical evidence of this because the Christian movement ended up being the most culturally consequential movement in human history. And at its inception, at that kind of moment of launch, it had 120 individuals in the room. This is also, of course, amazingly part of our Wesleyan heritage, which was built not primarily on the Sunday experience that was controlled by the Church of England, but by these smaller units of class meetings and so forth that brought people into much closer proximity and were actually much more formational. So you've got an amazing opportunity to live out your Wesleyan roots, our Wesleyan roots, and find ways to do things in small groups. The challenge is that most churches have been pretty good at the big gathering and often reasonably good at small groups under 10, but we know very little we know very little about the 10 to 50 range. And this is actually going to be the range that's available to us much more quickly than 100 plus will be available. So what can we learn quickly about gathering groups of 10 to 50 and making that a significant experience? That's going to be a huge challenge. The one place where it seems like this often happens actually is youth groups. So your youth pastor, or if you are a youth pastor, you may become the expert on the kind of gatherings and the kind of pastoral leadership that actually works in this environment. I think I'm actually going to wrap up there. I'll say 2 more sentences. I don't know how it feels to hear this or perhaps to read our article. It's understandable if it feels very daunting. It's understandable if it also feels like kind of a worst case scenario that we all hope doesn't come to pass. And I certainly hope that this is a milder pandemic, a milder economic recession, and a much quicker recovery and back to normal way faster than we hope or can see right now. If it is not, if it doesn't come to pass that it's better than we expect, if it is the worst case, I just think we have every reason to hope because God's people have been through the worst case scenario. That is exile. Israel, the nation of Israel, first the northern kingdom, then the southern kingdom, went through far worse than anything this pandemic will bring, as much as we can tell. Their leaders were deported, their culture was assimilated, attempted to be eradicated. In many ways, the northern kingdoms, the lost tribes, were eradicated. But the southern kingdom, which was carted off to Babylon and subjugated by Babylon, maintained their faith. And they actually discovered in exile that it was possible, over against the lament of Psalm 137, to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. We are going very possibly into very foreign territory, very new territory, in which we will feel like the things that were so meaningful to us, singing the songs of Zion, are not available. I believe we have every reason to hope that the presence of God is still available and the mission of God is still invested in God's people. And you're the ones who get to lead at this moment. It's an amazing moment. Thank you so much for your patience, which you didn't really have that much choice over, but Bishop, you could have interrupted, maybe you should have, so thank you for your patience, and I'll let you facilitate the conversation for the rest of the time.
Well, Andy, we are grateful for your comments and insight. I'm watching the chat room as people are sort of saying, ooh, that was an important thought. So people have been following you carefully, but I've had a few questions emailed in to me, and so let me share those with you. One of them builds on where you just were about sizes of groups. How can large churches function in this new reality? What if your average worship attendance is more than 200? How do we function at that size of church?
I think you are going to have to dramatically change what it means to gather, because there will be not just weeks but months in all likelihood where that former reality, I would almost as an exercise, I would almost encourage you to use the past tense. Our average attendance was but now we have a flock of 200 or 400 or whatever the number might be, and that is not now our average attendance. Our average attendance now will be limited by public health requirements. How will we do that? Well, I would say we should gather in as large groups as we can. I believe there is incredible value, as the author of the letter of the Hebrews says, in assembling ourselves together. This is of incredible importance for mental health, emotional health, spiritual health. So I would look at what's allowed by your jurisdiction and max that number out. However, you're going to need to do it with a degree of, what we call social distancing. That really means not just the physical spacing of 6 feet, but many other measures. And you will, to do it responsibly, you will need to enforce a whole bunch of protocols that are utterly unfamiliar to us in the United States. They actually are familiar to the church in parts of Asia that has been living, Hong Kong and China went through SARS in 2003, and that left a deep cultural memory. That's part of why those cultures are wearing masks much more readily than we have done. Their churches also remember to some extent how to enforce these protocols. So there's a very in-depth document that I'd recommend, and I can provide a link via your conference staff directly to it, by a Lutheran missionary in Hong Kong whose church is living through this. Hong Kong is living with everything we're living with. And he has a great guide to how a church can handle gatherings of up to about 100 people. Very briefly, you keep 6 feet between households. If people live in the same household, they don't have to separate. But between households and their belongings, actually the virus can travel on our stuff. Everyone washes their hands when they arrive. You check people's temperature when they arrive. This is it sounds crazy now, but it's going to be totally normal for the next many, many months in the United States. Everyone, when they go to work, will have their temperature checked. They'll have their temperature checked at your church as well. And there's some other really helpful recommendations he has, including universal use of masks and amendments to how, for example, communion is distributed. So all those things we're going to be thinking through. You will have to do it. Let me give you one encouraging moment from Scripture. The feeding of the 5,000 is a great metaphor for what some of our larger churches attempt to do. Not always that large, but many, many hundreds of people. And it's very interesting that Mark actually includes the detail that Jesus had the apostles arrange them by groups of 50 and 100. The very numbers we're going to be living with are there in the story. So you will be arranging your flock who used to gather with average attendance of such and such. Now your average attendance is going to be 50 or 100, and you'll have to find a way to do that effectively.
I'll turn to the next question. Sounds like the biggest financial challenge for the kind of church I've been leading in current and recent appointments is the vast commitment to building and physical infrastructure. Multiple air conditioning units that need replacement on a regular basis, debt on buildings, old buildings that need constant upkeep. Any advice for this, Pastor?
Yeah. This is very tricky, and it's the general cost in any economic transition of fixed costs in a way. That is infrastructure that's been built, but that is not necessarily ideally suited to the world we're in. In the blizzard, nothing you can do. In the winter, you start to be able to at least plan for a scenario, and this may not be available today because of limitations, public health limitations. But I would really quickly start asking, is there any way we can repurpose space in ways that bring in revenue? I think this is going to require, and I'm well aware that this is not available in all settings. And so this could be of no use to you individual, the person who asked that question, and I apologize if that's the case. But what we've seen in the organizations we work with at Praxis is that a surprising number that would look like they're totally stuck, dead in the water economically with machinery and with skill sets in their employees that were built for one thing that they can't do, that they've actually been able to discover ways to repurpose those people and those physical infrastructure for needs that really are present right now and that have an economic return. And I know that this is not what you went into ministry to think about is, ancillary revenue, but to the extent it's necessary for survival, I think there are some creative possibilities. And wouldn't it be amazing if we came out of this with a much higher utilization of our buildings than we often have? Church buildings are one of the most underutilized spaces in terms of economic and social value in most communities. And wouldn't it be great if that changed at least a little bit? So at the margin, that's one thing. And then I think you have to really ask, what can we defer? Because the space is less important than the people. What can we defer? Those are hard choices, and those hard choices are going to be necessary.
Let me remind all the people who are on this webinar that these questions are coming in to smartin@txcumc.org. That's the email address for Shannon Martin. I'll turn to the next question. What does this mean for how children are nurtured in the faith? Yes,
this has been weighing on me. And the short answer is I don't know. I am eager to see what many, many different people build and create in this time. One thing that you are undoubtedly aware of is children are very fortunately not at much risk in terms of morbidity and mortality from this virus, but they probably, as far as we know, are really good transmitters of the virus to parents and grandparents. So we have to be very, very mindful of the transmission risks when we gather children, even when we can come back in groups. I think we're going to need probably a lot more people who are willing to invest their time with defined groups of children. The most effective way to prevent transmission of the virus is to create cohorts, essentially, that go through life together and that play and interact with each other, but not with other groups. And so daycare centers, for example, are setting up groups of 10 children with a teacher who's always with that same group of 10. And they play together, they take their meals together. In daycare, there's no such thing as social distancing, right? And so you may well want to think about, if only because even when the public health regulations maybe have changed, the peace of mind issues for your congregation may still be very alive as long as the virus is still present in the population. You may want to think about that model of a small group of kids who always are together when they're at church, with a teacher or teachers, maybe two, who are always with them. And those kinds of models can at least reduce the public health risks. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is that for youth formation, it seems to me that camps and what we sometimes call mission trips, though I'd prefer to call them perhaps service or learning trips, these are some of the most formational things we do, and they're probably going to be unavailable for a couple of years. I don't think we're going to have any camping anywhere in the US this summer. And I don't know how soon we're going to be able to travel, certainly not in the way we used to be able to do. And what kinds of pilgrimages will we offer our youth in a time when camping and mission trips are not available? Because I think pilgrimage, especially in the teenage years, that displacement from your home environment, that travel to be in a place where you believe God might meet you, this is just of tremendous spiritual importance. And we're going to need rapid, massive creativity in how we provide that to this generation of adolescents.
Related to this is a question about screen fatigue. Is it going to be a factor in this new reality, and especially with our children?
Well, I partly hope so. The book that I've written that has sold the most copies is a book called The Tech-Wise Family. It's a book about technology and family life, and it was written before all this happened. And it advocates for a way of life that probably seems completely impossible now, in which we really limit the use of screens, especially in our homes. Though I would actually say we do well to limit the use of screens in any formative environment. So to me, the primary formative environments are home, school, and church, not necessarily in that order. The places where we want to be shaped as people are the places where screens are the least helpful. I think the silver lining in suddenly all of our schools having to do things online, all of our work having to happen online, all of our ministry having to happen online, is actually going to be, we're going to realize how limited these things are. My daughter came home from a residential college, is doing her classes online. She said, "Dad, I cannot wait to go back and be in a classroom with other students." Now, I don't know how soon that will happen for her. It could well be a year, 18, 24 months before she can do that. But when it becomes possible, we're going to realize screens are good for a few things, but not good for most things. And fortunately, from my point of view, there's going to be a real fatigue. I would recommend, and I'll send this link as well, along with the church response piece, highly recommend an article by a psychiatrist named Kurt Thompson about why we get so tired on Zoom. And he has just deep insights into how we're made as embodied creatures, embodied relational creatures. And it turns out it's really tiring to be disembodied. It takes a lot of effort to not use your body to communicate with other human beings. If I were having a normal conversation with you all, I'd be looking out the window, I'd be leaning back, I'd be moving around, my attention would shift, but in all kinds of ways I'd signal to you I really am present with you. But of course, over Zoom, I'm looking at this little lens that's the only way I can convey to you that you matter to me. I'm listening, I'm attending, and that's extremely tiring at length. One thing I think you should anticipate is that during the blizzard, people were willing to go to online church. I don't know what will happen, but I suspect we are going to see a dramatic fall off in attendance, online attendance, now that Easter is over, as people just get tired of something that really is not the real thing. And while I think we need some kind of Sunday worship offering, I feel like churches have put a lot of eggs in that basket of, and not all churches even have the resources to do this, but those that can have gone online. I would urge you to, keep doing some aspect of that because it seems essential for the weekly rhythm worshiping life of the Christian community. But to realize that's not going to feel like the real thing for the people that you are entrusted to shepherd, and you need to find ways that really are the real thing as soon as possible in groups of people, even if they're small.
Okay, I'm going to just follow up with that comment. You talk about the real thing. Does that mean being present with each other physically in order for it to be the real thing?
Well, these are complex questions. Jesus, in his resurrection body, seems to be able to show up in rooms with locked doors, and so their presence for us as Christians is a complex matter, and Jesus is present to us now without his body being evident to us. Let's say, at least not his own individual human body. Perhaps his body, the body of Christ, is evident to us. I think we are made for embodied relationship, and that is the real. That is what God intends. That we are absent from it for a time, and that we have ways to ameliorate that, like we're doing now with media, is a kind of gift, but only as a temporary substitute. So I am pretty willing to say the embodied is the real. We are heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you can't disentangle those, and we're not one without the other. And so I think as soon as we are allowed to be together in person, even if it's only a group of 10, something powerful happens when 2 or 3 are gathered. Now, does that apply when we get together on Zoom in the name of Jesus? I do believe it does, but in an attenuated way. And I wouldn't want us ever to end up settling for this. As much as this is winter conditions, but we're building for a long season where we won't be locked in all the time. It just will be smaller. We'll be able to be together, just not in really large settings. So that's the horizon that I want us to be creatively preparing for.
Well, one questioner said something related to that. Will the new church become more like the early church, i.e. the home church?
Very possibly. I am very uncertain about the medium to long term. It's very hard to predict many things. Let me put it this way. If you experiment, prototype, pilot, launch, home church-based experiences that really do form people in Christ, that is not wasted effort, whatever church as a whole looks like 5 to 10 years from now. This was the genius of the early Methodist movement. We don't have to go back to the early church, but just think about the early Methodist movement, was that very gathering of people at that scale. And so is that the only way church looks? I think not. I think cathedrals, like if you think sort of in the ultimate sense, there's a cathedral aspect to the worshiping life of the people of God in God's economy and God's world that needs representation. And once this pandemic is fully past us, and once we have the economic resources, and hey, we have way more money than the medievals did, and they still built cathedrals, we can again aspire to gather in those great gathering places. But just a cathedral does not seem to be healthy for actual Christian formation and pilgrimage in the world. So the house church, is it only going to be house churches? Hard to say, but is everything we learn from building effective household level communities going to strengthen the church in the long run? Absolutely.
An interesting question, shifting a little bit onto larger outside the church things. How can we support our small business owners who are going through this same process with the church?
Yes. Well, I would say they need 3 kinds of help. One is pretty hard to provide at scale, and that's economic help. Of course, we have government programs, which we hope will be extended to some extent, but the government has its limits in what it can do. But we certainly hope there will be effective government programs that address some of the economic need. But then there's 2 other needs that government cannot directly address. One, let me put them in this order. What they most need is a creative community. They need some friends who help them think creatively about the situation they're in. We've seen the value of this in our community of entrepreneurs at Praxis. We work with founders, co-founders and CEOs of organizations, and that's a very lonely role. When you own the business, especially if you have people working for you, there's a tremendous sense of responsibility, a tremendous sense of vulnerability, and you really can't talk to the people who work for you about the biggest issues in your business. It's rare that you can. So the church could be an amazing place to provide community for people who are trying to think creatively at this moment. And it's so hard to be creative by yourself, especially when you're experiencing anxiety. I've felt this a lot in the past few weeks. I've had moments of great anxiety in the past few weeks. All my income evaporated at the beginning of this crisis. I'm a public speaker. I speak to groups of thousands of people. I used to in the past. I did that. The only times I've been able to be creative have been when I've been kind of recalled to a community of other people who understand and give me that room and help me think through the possibilities. The other thing I would say, and I actually think it comes temporally before the creativity, is actually a space to grieve, a space to lament. Lament is part of this experience. And by lament, I mean bringing our grief and indeed our rage and frustration and depression and anger before God in relationship with God. And that's such a deep part of what it is to be Christian, to be a biblical person. That's so much of the Psalms. And it's so little of what we know how to do as Americans. We're not a lamenting people, even though we have much to lament if we would only attend to it. And these small business owners, at least at the moment, even if it comes back, even if they get a government check, at this moment, they've lost everything they invested themselves in. And a place to lament that and pastoral care to work through that with God is of incredible importance. It's actually a precondition to moving into a creative posture. So those are ways, in some ways, only the church can help. And that's so crucial right now.
Can you speak to how this ice age changes society in general?
Oh boy, I don't know. I mean, Yogi Berra said it is difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So I'm not really in the prediction business. I'm in the scenario business and in the planning for possibilities business, I would say. It's so hard to say. It's so hard to say. Because the best analogy I can find in recent history is the combination of the Great War of 1914 to 1918 and the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920. And it is really not an exaggeration to say the Great War in particular, which we in America remember as World War I, changed everything in Europe. Before the Great War, the Austro-Hungarian Empire controlled a third of Europe. After the Great War, it did not exist. If you've read Philip Jenkins' remarkable book, the title of which is slightly escaping me, it might be called The Great and Holy War, about the religious roots of the World War I. You also know that the Great War was presented as a great religious, a crusade of Christendom, because before the Great War, Christendom was still a reality in Europe, in spite of the Enlightenment and so forth. It's not much of an exaggeration to say after the Great War and the Spanish flu, Europe was no longer Christian in the way it was before. The erosion of the institutional power of Christianity suddenly after the Great War was very striking. At the same time, especially in the United States, but in many ways also in Europe, you had what was called the Roaring Twenties, where people were giddier and happier and more carefree than they'd ever been in history. And there is no literature out of the Great War. There's lots of literature from the Great War. There's none from the Spanish flu. That pandemic, people didn't want to think about it. They didn't want to talk about it. They moved on, and there was this kind of mania, economic mania, cultural mania that followed. So it's so hard to predict how societies will respond. I think the one thing I will say, there will almost certainly be what I'd call a normalcy snapback. So we want to get back to normalcy. We saw this very vividly after 9/11, 2001. In the first couple of days after September 11th, 2001, I think all of us thought nothing's going to be the same. And in fact, even our own president said, well, start shopping, go back to the mall. And Americans wanted to do that. There's a normalcy snapback, but that doesn't mean normal has returned. And I think a lot of things in Europe looked superficially similar in 1925 to 1915, but actually the ground had completely shifted underneath the institutions of Europe, especially the Christian institutions. So we don't know. All we can do is be faithful today with an eye to the adversities that may be ahead, and be creative today in ways that will matter whatever scenario plays out. I think that's the important thing, is find ways to be creative that no matter what happens, it was worth doing. That's at least the best case.
Let me combine a couple of questions and begin with the recognition that you and I are both white guys. And so when I ask these, and yet we're the ones on the camera, and so this is an important topic. African-American churches are being the African-American community is being disproportionately affected by COVID, as well as immigrants who are outside of the sort of paper economy.
Yes.
How do we think about the impact on African-American and Hispanic and other immigrant churches?
Well, first with great lament. I will say something you wouldn't know about me is that a formative part of my education pastorally and actually musically was in the AME church, specifically the AME Zion church. I'm a Black gospel musician, believe it or not, but I have played Black gospel in many settings and have apprenticed in the Black church for a number of years. And as it happens, most of my friends who have suffered with COVID are of African descent, either immigrants from Africa or African-American. And so this is very close and it's very real, and we're seeing it in the statistics. And so the first thing is to lament that is happening with all the grief that we can bring before God. The question is, what do we build in response to the vulnerabilities of certain communities? And I think it's very important to highlight the vulnerabilities of immigrant communities, both documented and undocumented. I believe we're at a moment, there's so many reasons. This is why we have to lament. There's so many reasons to fear that the moment will pass and nothing will be done. But we're at a moment where we realize that the most vulnerable among us, that their vulnerabilities matter for all of us. A pandemic is a moment where you cannot segment off and ignore the vulnerability of certain communities because everyone is affected. And we're seeing this all over the world. It's not a US specific issue. It's happening in Singapore, where migrant workers in dormitories are the main source of further infections and risk to the whole population. And the inhumane way in which they're treated now affects even the most wealthy, privileged resident of Singapore, along with the most marginal. So the hope is that we would advocate for and begin to build systems that care for the most vulnerable. This is the core insight of what's called Catholic social teaching, which is the deepest body of Christian social thought, which is that the common good depends on the flourishing of the vulnerable. So you build your society to care for the most vulnerable, because if they can flourish, everyone else flourishes. And a society that's built on the flourishing of the powerful is actually extremely fragile and is actually much more vulnerable than it realizes. So, you know, in the short run, I think obviously we can provide all kinds of emotional support, as much financial support as we can. I will say, having apprenticed in the Black church, I think one of the very grievous things is how much of the Black church is so tactile, so connected, so embodied. It's way harder to take that online than the Presbyterian church, if you don't mind me saying. And so even support for pastors who are thinking through, how do we hold on to what is best in our worship culture while adjusting to the realities of COVID and pastoring the people through that. You and I, as white guys, will be just prayer warriors and supporters, holding up the arms of Joshua in that moment. And let's hope we can be a support in that way.
We are running out of time, but I want to make one comment from myself that I think may summarize everything that we've done. Let me remind everybody that the recording of this conversation will be posted on the conference website tomorrow, so you'll be able to revisit it. But I'm in your article, it said, we at Praxis are developing one potential scenario that assumes that for 12 to 18 months, the largest group that can be reliably gathered in person for shared formation and creative work will be about 10 people. The idea of 12 to 18 months of this, is that really how we need to be thinking, or is it even going to be worse than that?
I dearly hope it's not necessary. Partly because our own work as a nonprofit is entirely built on a model that requires more than 10. And I don't assign a high probability to that, but I do not assign a negligible probability. I would say 20 to 30%, perhaps. If every time you walked out of your house, there was a 1 in 5 chance a shingle would fall off the head and hit you off the roof and hit you on the head, you'd probably work on the roof. So if there's a 1 in 5 chance, we want to be ready for it because we don't want to go away. We believe our mission matters. And so I don't at all assume that under 10 will be enforced continually for 12 to 18 months. Seems very unlikely. It could be more than we think. It could come back more often than we'd like as a limit, especially in certain places. And I'll just say, if you prepare for it and it happens, you will be so glad you prepared. If you prepare for it, it doesn't happen. You have learned some amazing things about the heart of your mission, the mission you've been given by God, that matter no matter what the conditions. And I think you'll be able to use those learnings in really useful ways, whatever comes to pass, because we do not know. Yeah, it's just one scenario for sure. And I pray that much of this seems hilariously irrelevant in 6 to 12 months. I also pray that we don't miss what we felt in these moments and what we learned, and what we tried and what we created, and that we have grown as leaders through this really difficult crucible of a time.
Andy, I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom and your speculation as well as your faith. It's been a pleasure getting acquainted with you. I think you have broadened our time frame and thinking, oh my gosh, we've really got to think about this in a long-term way, and also focused on redesign, which says we still have a purpose and we need to think creatively about how to embody that purpose in this coming ice age. Thank you so much, friends. We're bringing this to a close. God bless you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.